Chapter 6 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lena Emsley. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 6. The Elite of Redcastle. Redcastle is a country town. It is not a manufacturing town, or a seaport, or a garrison town, or a settlement in any manner designed to be of wide and general use to society. It exists for itself alone, and is exclusive to a fault. It is on the high road to nowhere. Erase it from the map of England tomorrow, and nobody but its own inhabitants would be the worse off for its evanishment. It produces nothing but elderly people with limited incomes, and scandal. For the cultivation of this last article, Redcastle is like a mushroom bed in a cellar, a dark corner of the land in which fungi abound and flourish. It is not a bad town in which to enjoy a brief span of repose from the turmoil and bustle of the industrial and commercial world, the world of labour and pleasure, profit, loss, and pain. Not a bad old town in which to dream away a joyless, painless old age. But to live in Redcastle, to bound one's hopes within its brick and mortar confines, to regulate one's life by its petty proprieties and narrow creed. Heaven pity that wretch to whom destiny flings the lot of life-long bondage in Redcastle. It is a clean old town. Scarcely in laborious Holland, where the servant maids scrub the chimney-pots and pipe clay the gutters, would you find a cleaner. A rainy day, which makes mud and slush in busier places, only washes down and renovates Redcastle. The one wide street, with its massive old brick houses, square and strong and substantial, the historic gateway which divides the one street into two, below bar and above bar, and the fine old Coach and Horses Inn, where seldom coaches or horses are seen to stop, the inn which, save for the mildest indulgence in billiards and brandy and soda among the youth of the town, seems to exist rather as a part and parcel of Redcastle, an institution essential to the honour and glory of the town, than for any commercial purpose, since it appears morally impossible that the establishment can be self-supporting. All these are the pink of cleanliness. The pretty little minster, more architecturally perfect than many a grander fane, looks as if it were kept under a glass shade. The market-place presents on off days a broad expanse of spotless pavement, blinking and smiling up at the sun. The turnpike road on which Redcastle lies is one of the best in Yorkshire. The narrow lanes and by-streets leading up to that broad stretch of common land known as Redcastle Woods, apparently for the sole reason that it is barren of anything taller than a hazel bush, are innocent of mud or smoke. The scanty suburbs of the town present a sprinkling of smallish houses, for the most part uninteresting of aspect, but all scrupulously clean. Those modern edifices, the Wesleyan Chapel, the Independent Chapel, and that Masonic temple, the Athena Lodge, are of whitest freestone, with shining windows and hearthstone steps embellishing their classic porticos. Redcastle, producing nothing and offering no attraction to visitors, is naturally not a wealthy settlement. The rich inhabitants of Redcastle can be counted on the fingers of a single hand. Yet there is perhaps no town in England in which respect for wealth is more deeply implanted in the human mind. It is a saying of the profane that twopence halfpenny will not consort with twopence in Redcastle. But this is not a true saying, for more than it worships wealth, does Redcastle worship appearances, and if A with twopence can put on the semblance of threepence, he shall assuredly be held higher than C, who lacks the art to obtain as much out of twopence halfpenny. The elite of Redcastle, that is to say, persons of fixed income or established professional earning, ranging from 8 to 1800 per annum, live within a narrow circle. The houses immediately below bar and the houses immediately above bar shelter the aristocracy of the town. Below bar, grave old red brick houses of the early Georgian period, roomy and comfortable within, respectable of aspect without. Above bar, houses of a more modern date, stone facades, French windows, porches, verandas, larger gardens and ostentatious stabling, rarely used, save for the accommodation of a pony chaise, like one of Falstaff's buck-baskets. Within this charmed circle, in the largest of the stone-fronted houses above Bar, resides Colonel Stormont, who enjoys the privileges of retirement and half-pay, cheered by the society of his wife and family, the family consisting of a grown-up son and 2 grown-up daughters, who, of various views upon other questions, are at one in the opinion that Redcastle was called into being for their especial behoof, and who regulate their conduct by that idea. Colonel and Mrs. Stormont take the lead in Redcastle society. Their names are at the head of the croquet and archery club, which blackballs everyone who is suspected of having once had a cousin connected with trade. They are chief patrons of the assize and Masonic balls. They sanctify the more chaste and classic of the Redcastle concerts with their august presence, or at least Mrs. Stormont allows her name to grace the list of patronesses and add a lustre to the programme of the evening's harmony. If St. Cecilia had come back to life again, she could hardly have been in more request among the concert-givers than Mrs. Stormont, who scarcely knows Mozart from Offenbach or Beethoven from Brinley Richards. To offend Colonel or Mrs. Stormont would be to be at war with Redcastle, and it is doubtful if anyone so unfortunately placed could continue to reside in the town. He would be obliged to depart, exiled by that awful ban, like Ovid from Rome or Dante from Florence. In the large stucco-fronted house with the Norman turret resides Mr. Marlin Spike, the great shipbuilder of Crampston-on-Tiber. Mr. and Mrs. Spike live with some splendour, but a self-contained kind of life, not conducive to wide popularity. They receive very little company. Their names grace the subscription list of no local charity. They patronize no local entertainment. They attend no Masonic or benevolent hall. They are negatively great, and will be remembered when they are dead for the many noble deeds they have not done. After the Stormonts and the Marlin Spikes come the professional classes below Bar. Mr. Jewson, the chief local solicitor and vestry clerk, Dr. Mitsand, an elderly man of some distinction, being one of the army surgeons who endured and ameliorated the miseries of the Crimean War, Mr. Groshen, the banker, Mr. Farrer, the curate, and a few others whom it is needless to particularize. On the outskirts of the town reside 3 or 4 gentlemen who derive their income from houses or lands, are more rustic in their bearing and attire than the inhabitants of the citadel, and in a general way give themselves airs, as affecting to belong to the county families. Afar off, in the various fastnesses, isolated, inaccessible, unapproachable, live the county families. A few of them are on visiting terms with the Stormonts, Dr. Mitsand, and the clergy of Redcastle, but they regard the town otherwise as a depot for groceries and draperies, and a centre of radicalism for the lower classes. Their big family landaus, with tall slab-sided horses and brass harness, pervade the street on fine afternoons. Their sons trot briskly through the quiet town on hunting mornings in well-worn pink. They turn out occasionally for a concert, and take care to testify by loud talk and laughter among themselves, and a supercilious contemplation of the rest of the audience through eyeglasses, that they hold themselves as creatures apart from the townspeople. Within 10 miles of Redcastle is that thriving seaport, Crampston-on-Tiber, famous for shipbuilding, rope-making, linseed crushing, sugar baking, and general exportation and importation. Crampston has noisy, bustling streets, miles of quays, labyrinths of docks, drawbridges that arrest the pedestrian at every turn, so intersected is the land by narrow inlets of water. Crampston has very little society, in the Redcastle sense of that word, but it has commercial activity, the vigorously throbbing pulse of active and useful life, name and place and power in the world. The word of Crampston, branded on bale or packing case, is familiar in Buenos Aires or Sierra Leone, in Pernambuco or Timbuktu, while the name of Redcastle is hardly known out of the Post Office or British Gazetteer. Among the elite of Redcastle, the Archons, the Equestrian Order, Robert Faunthorpe, surgeon and parish doctor, has no place. The elite give him good day when they meet him trudging toilfully above or below bar, or trotting meekly along one of the lanes on his unkempt pony. Good, easy-going little man, ever ready to help the helpless to whom he ministers, often squeezing a shilling or a sixpence out of his ill-furnished purse, where he feels that drugs alone are of no avail. Kindly gentleman though he is, the elite of Redcastle cannot recognise him as a member of their order. He lives in a shabby red house at the fag end of town, grooms his pony, digs in the garden, keeps one old woman servant of eccentric aspect. He takes snuff inordinately, perhaps it is his only consolation, and the normal shabbiness of his clothes is enhanced by the process. His existence is altogether unorthodox. He is beyond the pale. True that he has reared 3 orphan nieces, the children of a brother who died penniless 10 years ago, and it is hardly to be supposed that this act of benevolence has not cost him as much as the maintenance of a groom and gardener. But Redcastle cannot recognise these small charities. They judge a man as they judge his house, by the front which he presents to the world. They would recognise the groom and gardener as elements of social status. They smile gently at the idea of the 3 orphan nieces as a harmless eccentricity of that eccentric little man, Dr. Faunthorpe. Happily, Robert Faunthorpe, M.R.C.S. and doctor by courtesy, is of all men the last to regret that social heaven to which he has never ascended. He sees Colonel and Mrs. Stormont, Dr. Mitsand and Mr. and Mrs. Groshen revolving in their orbits as he sees the planets, and envies them no more. The idea that they do him any unkindness by not inviting him to their dinner parties, by not extending the hand of friendship to his fatherless nieces, never enters his mind. He is so simple-minded a little man that he is content to go his way and let others go theirs. An eccentric, evidently, as Redcastle opines. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lena Emsley. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 7. Drifting into Haven. It is a soft, calm evening early in April, and Dr. Faunthorpe's shabby old house is as much brightened by the westering sunlight as it can be brightened by anything less than the 3 coats of paint for which its worm-eaten woodwork has been languishing for the last 20 years. There has not been a £5 note expended upon the repair or the beautification of Robert Faunthorpe's house within the memory of the oldest inhabitant of Redcastle. It is scrupulously clean, and that is the best that can be said of it. There is a small garden in front, where flourish those homely perennials which demand little care and no artificial nutriment: lupins, Canterbury bells, flags, London pride, polyanthuses, primroses, and wallflowers. Behind the house there is a long strip of ground where the surgeon cultivates cabbages and potatoes, leeks and potherbs, leaving only 2 narrow borders for floriculture. Happily there are ancient rose bushes in these neglected borders, rose bushes from which Beauty's father might have gathered those large red cup-shaped cabbage roses that grow in a child's picture book. The borders are edged with box, tall and thick, box that has been growing for a century. The low red walls, crumbling into hollows where the birds have pecked at the brickwork, crowned with dragon's mouth, stonecrop, and houseleek, would be delicious in a picture, and are not unlovely in reality. At the bottom of this long narrow garden there is a patch of ground set apart for the benefit of Scrub the pony, upon which grow purple-flowered tares, 3 crops in a 12-month sometimes. Within, the house has a certain air of homely comfort. The shabby old furniture has that well-worn look which in some wise endears goods and chattels to their owners. Beeswax and labour have done their best to brighten and beautify the ancient mahogany bureaus, the clumsy walnut-wood bedsteads and tables, made at a time when walnut-wood was almost as cheap as deal. Cracked old jars and bottles of common blue delf adorn the tall, narrow wooden mantelpieces. Curtains of watered marine, once crimson but faded to a tawny brown, drape the deeply recessed windows of parlour and surgery. The rooms are spacious but low, the ceilings sustained by massive beams painted black. The walls are for the most part panelled, and the panelling has been painted a dingy pink or a dirty drab. To keep this panelling spotless is the old servant's anxious care, and much house flannel and soft soap are expended thereupon to Dr. Faunthorpe's aggravation, that good easy man having no passion for cleanliness in the abstract. A wide stone passage leads from the front door to the half-glass door opening into the back garden, thus letting light and air through the old house. A clumsy mahogany-framed barometer, a row of hat-pegs, and a faded map of England are the only furniture of this passage, or hall, as a modern house-agent would call it. A roomy, solid old staircase, with shallow treads and ponderous balusters, leads to the upper chambers, which are numerous and of fair size. To the right of the front door is the parlour, on the left the surgery. Behind the surgery is the best parlour. Behind the everyday parlour is the large stone-paved kitchen. For this house, with its acre of garden, Dr. Faunthorpe pays £20 a year. So there is some saving of house rent in residence at Redcastle, if your soul aspires not after any higher state than comfortable vegetation, and you are content to inhabit the inferior end of town. Dr. Faunthorpe paces his front garden on this calm April evening, smoking his pipe. He is a smoker as well as a snuffer, and finds solace in tobacco after his daily round. This is his hour of rest and leisure. True that it may be broken in upon at any moment by some sudden call for his services, but his regular daily labour, his measured grind at life's mill, is over. He prefers the small front garden for his evening pipe to the larger ground at the back. First, because he is to the fore if wanted, and secondly, because his house being on the high road, it is just possible that something may go by, vehicle or passenger, to the enlivenment of his leisure. He is meditative and silent, but not alone. His niece Marian, a tall girl with wavy light hair and a pre-Raphaelite figure, stands in a listless attitude by the gate. His niece Jenny, an overgrown girl of 12, with a very short frock and stalwart legs, encased in brown worsted stockings, is watering the flowers, and making as much mess as it is possible to make in the operation. "Just look what puddles you are making in the path, stupid!" exclaims the elder sister, peevishly regarding the efforts of her junior. "I do wish you'd leave things alone. You're always up to some mischief or other." "I suppose I shouldn't be mischievous if I let the primroses die for want of water," remonstrates the junior, in no wise abashed. "That's what you do with your laziness and fine lady ways. You were bad enough before you went to stay with Uncle Stephen, but you're ever so much worse now. I'm sure I wish he'd kept you there instead of sending you back like a bad penny. Uncle Robert and I were as jolly as sandboys while you were away." The young person sets down her water pot and delivers this diatribe with arms akimbo like Madame Anjou's daughter. Marian shudders. "Sandboys! What an expression for a young lady!" she ejaculates. "Pray where's the harm in sandboys?" demands the incorrigible Jenny. "They're more respectable than you, as far as I can see, for they get their own living." "My dear," remonstrates Uncle Robert mildly, "that is not the way to address your elder sister." "Why does she come and loaf about here, then, with her stuck-upishness? Why doesn't she go and be a governess like Sybil? If she heard what Hester says of her, she'd be ashamed of herself." "My love, you have no right to quote Hester." "Hester is an impertinent, mischief-making creature," exclaims Marian. "And as to your sister going out as a governess, my dear," continues Uncle Robert mildly, "with her expectations it would be about the most foolish thing she could do." "Expectations! Dead men's shoes!" exclaims the terrible child, twirling the watering can so that its last drops sprinkle Marian's pretty blue dress. "I should hate myself if I was mean enough to calculate upon what anyone would leave me." "Quite right of you," says Marian, with a supercilious laugh, that sneering schoolgirl laugh, which we all remember to have been crushed by occasionally in our youth. "But certainly no one is likely to leave you money." "I dare say not, with you in the way." answers the irrepressible Jenny. "They'd feel they were doing an act of charity bestowing their fortune on you, for it would be the same as leaving it to the asylum for idiots. One simpleton provided for, at any rate." With this the imp swings round upon her heels as on a pivot, brandishes the watering pot as a savage his club, and gallops into the house. Jane Faunthorpe never walks. She has the action of an unbroken colt, and seems, when in motion, to have as many legs as that animal. When she comes downstairs, there is a sound as of a sack of coals flung from the upper story. How the old house sustains itself under her youthful vigour is a mystery to the parish doctor. "I'd run after her and give her a good box on the ears," says Marion viciously, "if I didn't want to see the omnibus go by." The omnibus is a stunted covered vehicle like a carrier's cart, garnished with glazed windows, which plies between the station and the outskirts of Redcastle, and it is nearly time for this conveyance to pass with its evening freight. There are sometimes as many as 5 people arrive by the 6 o'clock train from Crampston. Nay, the Crampston train sometimes brings that rare bird, a passenger from London. "It's a pity you ever sent that child to a day school, Uncle Robert," Marion remarks presently, wiping the water spots daintily from her dress. "She was bad enough before, but now she's simply intolerable." "My love, I couldn't afford a boarding school, and I was obliged to send her somewhere," replies the surgeon in his long suffering way. "At home she was learning only to dig potatoes and to whistle, neither of which pursuits is an attractive accomplishment in a young lady. The child is not bad at bottom." "Perhaps not," answers Marion snappishly, "but the bottom must be a long way down. I've never come to it yet." "She is very warm-hearted." "Yes, if warmth of heart consists in rushing at one like an avalanche, hugging one round the neck like a bear, and rumpling one's collar atrociously without the faintest provocation." "She is not of an idle disposition," remonstrates the uncle. "I found her cleaning the back kitchen windows at 6:30 this morning. No one had asked her to do it." "Of course not. That's just the reason she did it." "If you would take a little more pains with her, Marion," suggests Dr. Faunthorpe timidly. "Pains! I might take agonies, and without the least effect. Didn't I begin to teach her music?" "Yes, my dear, but you didn't go on." "Well, you just try to teach her anything, Uncle Robert. Just try, that's all," says Marion, with awful significance, and then breaks out with a sigh. "Oh dear, is this precious old omnibus never coming?" "It is rather late, my dear, but as it isn't going to bring us anyone we care about, we needn't worry ourselves about it. It would be something to look at just for a minute. If you only knew what a difference there is between the lookout down here and above Bar. There's almost always something going by. Mrs. Stormont's basket carriage, or Master Groshen's pony, or the butcher's cart. Ah, my dear, I'm afraid that long visit to your Uncle Trenchard has spoiled you for my quiet home." "No, it hasn't, uncle," answers the girl, with a little gush of feeling in the midst of her petulance, just strong enough to show the better side of her nature. "No, it hasn't, for this is home and that isn't. I should always feel that if I spent the rest of my life with Uncle Stephen. Of all the old fidgets. Well, I suppose I oughtn't to say anything against him, for he has been very kind to me in his way. He has given me a good deal of money from first to last, though I must say he doled it out stingily, as if he liked the money better than me. And it is nice staying at his house. One feels oneself somebody. Only think of the Stormonts and the Groshens and the Marlin Spikes calling on him before he had been 3 weeks in Redcastle, while you've lived here 30 years and they've never called upon you." "People at this end of the town are not visited, my dear," replies the doctor mildly, as one who bows to the mysterious ways of Providence and questions not. "I dare say the elite of Redcastle called upon your uncle out of kindness, he being a stranger." "He being a millionaire, uncle, that's what you mean. Very much they'd have called upon him if he'd been a stranger who wanted to get his living. Think of the Stormonts giving a dinner party on purpose for him, and inviting me, after ignoring me for the last 4 years, staring me in the face after church for 200 Sundays, and taking no more interest in me than if I were a stone cherub on a tablet in the minster, and now all of a sudden being so fond of me. It's too ridiculous. If I was as worldly as they are, I'd take a little more pains not to show it." "The world is worldly, my love," replies uncle Robert with his resigned air. "You can hardly expect it to be otherwise. For my part, I am very glad to think that the Stormonts have taken notice of you, and that you've been invited out with Mr. Trenchard. It may lead to your making a good marriage, though you needn't set your mind upon that now, as it is tolerably certain your uncle will leave you an independence. I only wish Sibyl were at home to have her share of good fortune." "It's her own fault if she isn't," says Marion. "Say rather her conscientiousness, my dear. She doesn't like to leave Mrs. Hazelton in a difficulty about her children, and very right too. But I hope Mrs. Hazelton will suit herself with a new governess very soon, and let Sibyl come home. Mr. Trenchard has asked for her so often, and it really seems flying in the face of Providence for her to be out of the way." "If she wasn't a stupid she wouldn't be at Mrs. Hazelton's beck and call," says Marion, and then exclaims shrilly, "Here's the omnibus, and lots of people inside. Why, there's someone nodding to us, a lady in a grey hat, and, I declare, the bus is stopping. Why, it's Sibyl!" The blundering vehicle stops before Dr. Faunthorpe's gate. A shabby carpet bag, only a carpet bag, is handed down from the roof, and in the next instant Sibyl is in the homely little garden, sobbing hysterically on her uncle's shoulder. He presses her to his breast tenderly, and looks in the pale wan face. "Why, my darling, how ill you look, how changed, how thin!" "I have had so much hard work, uncle," she answers faintly. "But thank God, I am home at last." End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stroat, Turks and Caicos Islands. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 8. The Return of the Prodigal. "Home at last," cries the wanderer with glad thankfulness. This is a night of rejoicing in Dr. Faunthorpe's modest dwelling. The prodigal daughter has returned, and the fatted calf, or at least so much of him as a cutlet, fried as only Hester can fry a veal cutlet, is served up in her honour. How cheery and homely the common parlour, with its shabby old furniture, dimly illuminated by 2 composite candles which leave the panelled corners in densest shadow, seems to those tired eyes. "It is so nice to be at home again, uncle," says Sibyl lovingly, as she draws her chair a little nearer the doctor's at supper time. "What an old dear Hester is, and how deliciously she cooks." "If you're so fond of home, I wonder you stayed away so long," remarks Marion, who cannot help being occasionally disagreeable in her petty way. There was nothing large-minded about Marion, Sibyl used to complain. She would never commit a big sin, but would forfeit heaven by a multitude of infinitesimal faults. "Marion's faults are like the animalcule in a glass of water," remarked Sibyl on another occasion, "too minute to be seen without a microscope, but making the water unwholesome all the same." "I had to stop away to suit other people's convenience," replies the prodigal, looking downward as she squeezes lemon juice upon her cutlet. "How altered you must be," says that odious Marion. "Other people's convenience used to be the last thing you thought about. When is your luggage coming?" "My luggage? I brought it with me." "I mean the rest of your luggage. The omnibus man brought in nothing but a carpet bag." "That is my luggage," answers Sibyl, colouring to the roots of her hair. It is the first tinge of red that has warmed her delicate cheek since her arrival. "I gave one of Mrs. Hazelton's servants that horrid old heavy trunk of mine." "But your dresses, your linen, you can't get that all into a carpet bag," cries Marion, almost in a shriek. To be without a variety of clothes is the last calamity she can conceive among the miseries of humanity. "I have not one dress besides this. You can't have any notion how one's dresses wear out in a schoolroom. Mischievous romping girls pulling one about all day long. Ink spilt in every direction, candle grease on all the tables, cups of tea perpetually turned over. I was determined to buy nothing during the last quarter, so I wore my old dresses till they were almost in rags, and gave them to my favourite housemaid when I came away." "I dare say it was an excellent plan," says Marion, shrugging her thin shoulders, "but you won't be in a condition to make a very good appearance in Redcastle till you've new things. People will expect you to bring down the London fashions too. They come out on the 1st of March, don't they?" "What a pity fate made you a gentleman's daughter, Marion," replies Sibyl with a cold sneer. "You would have made such a capital milliner. Your soul would have been in your work." Dr. Faunthorpe sits back in his chair, reposeful, after that little bit of hot supper which is not an everyday luxury. The small snappings and snarlings of his nieces hardly discompose him. He is used to their sisterly talk. He is glad to have his handsome niece at home again, seated close to his chair, with all those familiar winning ways which have won her the first place in his heart. Small gushings of loving speech, tender little smiles, gentle touches of a white fluttering hand, graces of manner which may mean very little but are very sweet, petty Circean arts which have beguiled honest men to ruin and death before to-day. "My darling," he says presently, as the dark brown eyes smile upon him, brightening in the candlelight, "I am so glad you've come back. It wasn't wise to stay away so long at the risk of vexing your Uncle Trenchard, but I'll say no more about that. You are here and all is well. You must go and see him to-morrow." "How can she?" exclaims Marion. "In that gown?" pointing contemptuously to Sibyl's shabby alpaca, an alpaca which has seen much service, cockled by the rain and frayed at the edges of the cuffs, and with that shrunken and dwindled appearance that ill-used garments are apt to assume. "Pshaw! What does her gown matter? You can lend her a gown. You have gowns enough and to spare." "None that will fit Sibyl," replies Marion, who prides herself on her superior height. "She's welcome to wear one, but it'll be 2 inches on the ground." "Can't she run a tuck or cut a bit off?" argues Uncle Robert. "I shall have to give you a tonic, my love," he adds, contemplating his elder niece anxiously. "You're looking so fagged and worn." "I'm at home with you, Uncle Robert. That is the best tonic for me," replies the girl fondly. She is fond of him tonight. This shabby old home, which she abandoned in sheer discontent 2 years ago, seems very dear to her just now. It is a haven for a storm-beaten soul. "You'll have a better home than this, my pet, I hope, for the greater part of your time," answers the doctor cheerily. "I've no doubt that your Uncle Trenchard will ask you to stay with him as he did Marion. She was quite 3 months at Lancaster Lodge, and is to go back again by and by. I look upon her as little more than a visitor here, but she is kind enough to make the best of her old Uncle Robert's humdrum house." "It's a great relief to be here for a change, uncle," answers Marion. "I felt like a fine lady at Uncle Trenchard's, but I feel my own mistress here. If it wasn't for that tyrannical old Hester, your house would be Liberty Hall, and I can forgive even Hester when she's in good humour and makes hot cakes for breakfast." An hour later, and Uncle Robert has smoked his after-supper pipe, and the girls are in their bedroom, the old room which Sibyl knows so well, with its ridiculous flowered paper, low ceiling and high painted dado, and curious brass safety bolts upon the door, as if burglars were a contingency to be provided against in that humble dwelling. How well she remembers the long narrow chimney-piece, the basket-shaped grate with its wide hobs, the open-work brass fender and painted 4-post bedstead, drab and green, with skimpy dimity valance and 2 starveling curtains. The rickety deal dressing-table, with streaky-looking glass which used to reflect a fair girl's face wondering at its own beauty. The tall mahogany wardrobe that never was opened without threatening to topple over and wreak destruction on its violator. The scanty strips of bedside carpet, dull in colour and perplexing in pattern. How often has she pored and puzzled over those interwoven scrolls in sheer idleness of thought? All things are unchanged. There are the wretched old ornaments on the mantelpiece, the pasteboard spill-boxes, adorned with faded gold paper, ancient works of art by fingers that had long been dust, the little black wedgwood vases, urn-shaped, funereal, the hand-screens with lithographs of Dr. Syntax pasted thereupon, and more paper gilding, the 2 black profile miniatures of dead and forgotten relatives. It seems a dear old room somehow to Sybil tonight, for it brings back the feelings of her innocent girlish days, when life, if it had few pleasures, had no cares. Now life means perplexity. Existence is an entanglement from which only some happy turn of fortune can extricate her. She sits in her old place on the window seat and loosens the long twisted roll of rich brown hair which falls over her bare shoulders like shining drapery. "Goodness!" cries Marion. "How skinny your shoulders have grown!" "Have they?" said Sybil coolly, glancing downwards at the white neck and arms in which the bones are too sharply defined for beauty. "Then we shall look more like sisters when we wear low dresses. Your shoulders were always skinny." Marion is silenced for the moment, and proceeds with the destruction of that elaborate edifice of hair and hair-pads which she constructs with infinite pains every morning, even though no one outside her own small family circle is likely to be gratified by the sight thereof. Marion's hair has been washed and doctored to the fashionable pre-Raphaelite colour. It is thick and fluffy and short, only just covering the points of her bony shoulders, and standing out round her head like an exaggerated nimbus. It is not bad hair altogether, and Marion thinks it one of her strong points, like her pre-Raphaelite figure, her low narrow foot, 18-inch waist, arched eyebrows, white teeth, and other small graces, some of which are the praiseworthy result of patient training. "Do let me see your pretty things, Sybil," the younger sister exclaims presently, twisting one of her yellow tresses in and out of a hairpin. The elder looks up, startled out of profound reverie. "What pretty things?" "Well, you must have something to show me. Presents? Things you have bought out of your salary? I'm sure I should have a lot to show out of £40 a year for 2 years. Glove boxes, sealskin purses, card cases, neckties, lace, gloves, and so on. I dare say that carpet-bag is bursting with them." "It is doing nothing of the kind. I found that it was as much as I could do to dress myself decently for Mrs. Hazelton's parties and pay my laundress. Evening dresses are so unprofitable." "They must be, if you have nothing to show out of £80. I never thought you could bring yourself to wear such a dress as that alpaca thing," adds Marion, pointing contemptuously to Sybil's shabby gown hanging on a peg upon the door. "I expected to see you come home quite a woman of fashion." "People who teach unruly children have to take them out walking in all weathers have not much chance of being fashionably dressed," answers Sybil wearily. "Perhaps if you could contrive to put dress out of your mind for 5 minutes or so, Marion, we might have a little rational conversation." "Oh, very well. Of course I know what an inferior mind mine is. You used to tell me so often enough. But you were once rather fond of talking about dress, and I thought perhaps, if you've nothing to show me, you might like to see my dresses. Not homemade. Miss Eilert has made every one, and a pretty price she has charged me." Marion wrenches open the refractory door of the wardrobe and displays 3 calico-shrouded garments, hanging in a row, like sheeted ghosts. One by one she brings forth these treasures, whisking off their covering and displaying each one to Sybil with a dexterous twirl of her arm. A bronze-brown silk, a pale grey with elaborate ruchings of satin, a black silk which stands on end for very richness of fabric. "There!" she exclaims, swelling with pride. "I wore the grey, new, at Colonel Stormont's." "At Colonel Stormont's? Is the world coming to an end? Or what convulsion of nature brought you and the Stormonts together?" "I was asked to dinner with Uncle Trenchard." "And Uncle Trenchard gave you the money to buy those dresses, of course?" "Yes. He said, 'Well, my dear, I suppose you'll want a new gown.' And then he gave a heavy sigh and took a banknote out of an old-fashioned red pocket-book, and then he looked at the note so long that I was afraid he was going to change his mind, and then he gave another sigh, deeper than the first, and handed me the note, a £10 note. I tried to kiss him the first time, but he didn't seem to like that, for he gave me a little peevish push and said, 'There, my dear, that'll do.' Funny old man. How many £10 notes has he given you?" "4 altogether. He always sighs just in the same way, as if every note was a wrench. He's inordinately rich, of course, but it seems to hurt him so to part with his money that I can't help thinking of that dreadful story of Douglas Jerrold's, The Man Made of Money, and fancying that Uncle Trenchard is unrolling a bit of himself when he gives away a banknote." "It's only such people who get inordinately rich," replies Sybil, plaiting her long thick hair into one massive tail for the night. "And how did you get on with Uncle Trenchard, upon the whole?" "Oh, very well indeed. It was so nice driving about in his new barouche, with a lovely pair of chestnuts, and feeling oneself looked up to by all Redcastle. And I had a splendid bedroom and dressing room, and we dined at 7:30 every day with 2 men waiting upon us. I used to feel afraid of them just at first, especially the butler, who looks the image of Mr. Grosjean the banker, and that took away from the grandeur. But I soon got accustomed to them, and learned to speak to them in an off-hand way, just like Mrs. Stormont." "Marion," says Sybil earnestly, "do you think Uncle Trenchard intends to leave us his money?" "Well, I should think he must leave it to us or to hospitals, and if we can't manage to please him—" "We must please him, Marion, and wind ourselves into his withered old heart somehow. It would be ridiculous, abominable, shameful for the money to be left to hospitals when we want it so badly. It's no use to enjoy the luxuries of this house, to take a £10 note from him now and then. That kind of thing will only make poverty seem worse to us afterwards. We must have his fortune." Her eyes dilate and brighten, her lips tremble faintly as she leaves off speaking, and then her face changes in a moment, and tears run down her wan cheeks. "Gracious, Sybil," cries Marion, rushing at her with a bottle of eau de cologne and a towel, and dabbing her forehead with the perfume. "I declare you're quite hysterical. Of course we must have his money, if we can get it. What has the fidgety old thing come home to England for except to make our acquaintance and leave us his fortune? He has as good as said so ever so many times." Marion's sisterly attentions check that hysterical attack of Sybil's, and the 2 girls lie down side by side affectionately, after a brief formula in the way of evening prayer. Deep in the chill spring night, Sybil's head tosses restlessly on the pillow, and the sleeper's lips murmur sorrowfully in troubled dreams. "Alex, Alex, don't be so cruel, Alex. Forgive, your sake. Yes, yes, as much as for my own." So pleads the sinner's vexed soul, self-excusing, self-accusing, even in dreams. End of chapter 8. Read by Adrian Stroat. Turks and Caicos Islands. Chapter 9 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stroat, Turks and Caicos Islands. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 9. Uncle Trenchard. Stephen Trenchard paces his smooth gravel walk in the April sunshine after tiffin, looking at the sparrows and blackbirds and thrushes disporting blithely on his velvet lawn, or hopping away into the shadow of evergreens. Great masses of laurel and laurustimus, rhododendron and bay, which surround the smooth expanse of grass in a semicircular sweep. Very perfect is the order of Mr. Trenchard's garden. Not a yellow leaf on the laurels, not a daisy peeping pertly, silver white from the lawn, not a branch that grows awry. In the kitchen garden yonder, far away behind the shrubbery, the fan-shaped fruit trees look like geometrical patterns on the yellow brick walls. The apples and pears are all wired into exactest growth, and not a twig is allowed its own way. Mr. Trenchard is in his garden by 6 o'clock every morning, and his severe eye interrogates the smallest sprig of groundsel, and rebukes the very slugs that vie with him in early rising. Mr. Trenchard is not a master to be trifled with, and his gardeners know it. For every shilling he expends, he will have 12 pennyworth of labour, nay 13 or 14 pennyworth if he can get it, Woe be to the wretch who tries to put him off with 11 pence halfpennyworth of industry. I've had to work for my money, says Mr. Trenchard, and I expect value for my money from other people. He walks briskly up and down, looking to the right and left with an eye bright and quick as a bird's, a small black eye, which looks the blacker for its whitened lashes. He is of middle height, very thin, very yellow. He has sharply cut features, nose thin, pointed and aggressive looking, lips also thin and of a disagreeable pallid hue. Eyebrows iron grey, thick and bushy, brow narrow, perceptive ridge strongly marked, upper head receding. Hair thick, short and iron grey like the eyebrows, brushed into 2 sharp points like a terrier's ears. Mr. Trenchard wears nankeen waistcoat and trousers, very loose for his lean limbs, and a glossy black frock coat, also loose, a black satin scarf and a gold pin, and high shirt collars. A double gold eyeglass dangles on his breast, a glass which he wears for show rather than use, but which intensifies the severity of his countenance when he reproves his gardeners or lectures his butler. He is a man who has toiled early and late, until the other day, when he took it into his head to give up his counting-house to a junior partner, and come back to England and enjoy the evening of his life at his ease. He has been a man of one idea all his days, and the single object of his existence has been the accumulation of money. The process of money-making, the honour and homage which the world renders the reputed millionaire, these have been so sweet to him that the question of what he is to do with his wealth has rarely presented itself seriously to his mind. On his 69th birthday he awoke suddenly to the consciousness that whatever personal enjoyment he meant to have out of his wealth must be obtained within the next 10, 12 or 15 years. Even with his vigorous constitution he could hardly hope to live beyond the age of 85. 40 years in India must take something out of a man, be he never so temperate, and abstemiousness has been one of Stephen Trenchard's virtues. So, at 69 he said to himself, "It is time to go back to England. Let the world see what a position I have made for myself and take all the good I can out of life." His 70th birthday has not yet arrived, and he has built for his soul a lordly treasure house, or, in other words, he has taken upon lease, decorated and furnished, Lancaster Lodge, one of the best houses in his father's native town of Redcastle. He has hired servants, purchased carriages and horses, and begun a plain sailing Englishman's life on a very liberal scale. The result so far has been eminently satisfactory. His house to him a kingdom is. He rules his servants indoor and outdoor with a rod of iron, and feels himself a potentate. Very pleasant to him is the incense which Redcastle offers to his wealth. People whose fathers and grandfathers snubbed or ignored his father, the struggling solicitor, bow down and worship the Anglo-Indian plutocrat. He accepts their adoration with supreme coolness, and a quiet arrogance which his admirers extol as innate aristocracy of mind. It has pleased him to permit his niece Marion Thornthorpe to bask in the sunshine of his favour. She is not handsome enough to charm his eye, which is critical in the matter of feminine beauty, nor is she clever enough to amuse him, but she is rather a pretty thing to have about his house, and she does very well for a listener when he is in the humour to tell his prosy old stories of dead and gone Calcutta scandals. She knows how to hold her tongue when he is inclined to be silent, is solicitous for his small comforts, and quiet as a mouse when he takes his after-dinner nap. She behaves gracefully at table, neither eats nor drinks too much, looks stylish when fashionably dressed, moves about the house quietly, and is not altogether deficient in tact. He is content, therefore, to tolerate her as a frequent guest, but does not appreciate her warmly enough to ask her to take up her permanent abode with him. He has made many inquiries about Sibyl, and he has been vexed by her non-appearance. The Stormonts, the Groshans, and other notabilities have praised the absent girl's beauty, having found out all at once that a young person whose existence they never troubled themselves to acknowledge was the loveliest girl in Redcastle. "Quite the belle of the place, I assure you, Mr. Trenchard," says Mrs. Stormont. "Indeed," remarked Stephen Trenchard. "She was invited out very much, I suppose?" "Well, no, dear Mr. Trenchard. She was too young, you know, almost a child. And then your brother-in-law is so retiring. We can never have got him out of his shell." If there is one thing in the region of trifles outside the money market which Mr. Trenchard appreciates, it is the beauty in woman. Having heard his eldest niece is enthusiastically praised, he is particularly anxious to see her, ever so much the more anxious because her indifference has thwarted him. "She must be a queer kind of girl," he tells himself, "to hang back from a rich uncle to prefer drudging as a governess to sponging upon me. Marion is glad enough to take all she can get, and would kneel down and kiss my shoestring if I asked her. Her feelings are transparent enough. This other one must be something out of the common. A wonderful advantage this for Sibyl at starting, though it is an advantage she has gained accidentally." The great lodge bell clangs out, while Mr. Trenchard paces up and down and startles the respectable tranquillity of Above Bar with its clamour. He takes out his watch. Too early for a ceremonious visit. Mr. Trenchard walks round by the side windows of his large square mansion and comes within view of the gate. Two ladies enter, both young and slim, both tall, but one rather shorter than the other. The taller gives a little eager cry and runs forward to him. The second advances more slowly. "Dear Uncle Stephen!" cries Marion, pursing up her lips to be kissed, an operation which Uncle Stephen performs with a slightly reluctant air. "Sibyl has come home quite unexpectedly." Marion is always out of breath at the beginning of a visit, a pretty gushing way which some people call charming, "and I thought I might bring her to see you, dear Uncle John." "Thought you might bring her? Of course you might bring her. Haven't I been asking to see her since Christmas? So that is Sibyl, is it?" looking at the graceful figure lingering on the sunlit grass a few yards away from him. The bright face is flushed with palest rose, the dark full eyes are looking slyly at him, the dark brown hair is burnished by the sun, a fair picture of peerless youth for crabbed age to admire. "So that is Sibyl. Yes, she is very lovely. Those sycophants haven't exaggerated. Come here, my love. Come to your old uncle. Naughty child, why did you stay away so long?" He holds out his lean old arms. He folds her to his breast. He kisses her lovingly, paternally, as he has never yet kissed Marion, despite her affectionate blandishments. "Well, I never," Marion exclaims inwardly, standing a little aloof, and feeling that her reign is over. End of Chapter 9. Read by Adrian Stroat, Turks and Caicos Islands. Chapter 10 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stroat, Turks and Caicos Islands. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 10. Sibyl takes the lead. The favourable impression which Sibyl makes on her Uncle Stephen Trenchard is a fact too obvious for diversity of opinion. Marion reluctantly, sullenly even, admits that truth, with many sneers and innuendos about winning manners and hollow-heartedness. "I have never laid myself out to please Uncle Stephen as Sibyl lays herself out," murmurs the injured maiden. "I can't flatter people with my looks. I haven't Sibyl's caressing ways. I can't pretend more affection than I feel, and I must say that Uncle Stephen's dry little jerky ways of speaking and looking at one are not calculated to develop affection." Thus argues Marion in the easy atmosphere of Uncle Robert's everyday parlour. The girls are seated at supper with Dr. Faunthorpe's trifling with morsels of bread and cheese, after having dined with Mr. Trenchard. "I did not find him hard or dry," replies Sibyl. "He seems really kind and affectionate, and I was grateful for him for his warm welcome. I don't know what you mean by my laying myself out to please him. I remember that he was poor Mamma's only brother, and our own flesh and blood, the uncle I had heard so much about years ago, and I was naturally touched by our meeting." "Ah," says Marion, What an advantage it is for a woman to be able to cry when she likes. How do you manage it, Sib?" "If the tears came into my eyes today, it was because I am not very strong just now, Marion," answers Sibyl, reddening. "You are really the most horrid girl I ever met with." "However horrid I am not double-faced," replies the other promptly. "I should be ashamed to court Uncle Trenchard if I were you. When I remember the things you've said about him—" "What things?" "What a convenient memory yours is! Haven't you said that you despised him for his meanness as a young man? That he won his way in the world by double-dealing, by base flattery of his patron? That all your sympathy was with the young man he supplanted, Mr. Secretan?" At that name Sibyl flushes crimson, and then grows ashy pale. "Ah, I see you do remember," cries Marion triumphantly. "Marion," exclaims the mild little surgeon, with a rare flash of anger, "I will not have your sister teased in this manner. How dare you accuse her of falsehood or hypocrisy? She has as good a right to Stephen Trenchard's favour as you have." "Yes, and to his fortune." "Let her have it all," cries Marion, tempted to go into hysterics, but thinking better of it immediately. "She is to go and stay with him, and keep house for him, directly she can get her things ready, which, considering she came home without a rag, must take some time. She is to pay him a long visit. I'm nobody now." "My love, you have had your innings," pleads the pacific doctor. "Oh, of course, and just as I've got to understand his ways and know how to please him, I'm pushed aside." "My dear, his sense of justice will induce him to distribute his bounty fairly." "His sense of justice did not prevent his kissing Sibyl more affectionately than he has ever kissed me." "Mere fancy on your part, I have no doubt," says the doctor. After this little burst of temper, Marion calms down and is tolerably placable. She even discusses her sister's outfit with some show of interest. Mr. Trenchard has given Sibyl £25. "I suppose you are pretty well provided with cash, little one," he said, just before she wished him good night. "An independent-minded young woman like you, who goes out into the world to get her own living, is sure to have a well-lined purse." Sibyl blushed and owned that her purse had no lining at all. "Ah, I see. Sent help home to the old doctor," muttered Mr. Trenchard, fortunately not loud enough for Marion to hear, or that sharp-tongued young person would inevitably have set him right. "Well, well, very right, very proper." And then the crimson pocket-book was slowly brought forth, and Mr. Trenchard sighed a desponding sigh as he opened it, a sigh that was like a funeral gun for his departing banknotes. Sibyl went back to the dingy old house at the bottom of the town, richer by £25 than when she left it at midday. The girls go out gaily enough next morning to Carmichael's, the haberdashery, linen drapery, and silk mercery establishment of Redcastle, to supply the void in Sibyl's wardrobe. £25 is not much for a young lady of large ideas, but Sibyl, schooled in the philosophy of small means, makes the most of that sum. She spends all her money at Carmichael's, and trusts to Providence and Stephen Trenchard for means to pay Miss Eylett for the making up of her dresses, and Mr. Corksole, the bootmaker, for the equipment of her pretty little feet. It is astonishing how far away from the thoughts of Miss Eylett and Mr. Corksole seems the notion of payment now that Miss Faunthorpe's rich uncle has returned from the Indies. "You are to send the things home to me at Lancaster Lodge," says Sibyl, "and that seems as good as paying for them." Sibyl has asked for a week in which to prepare herself for this important visit, and that week is occupied in the stitching, hemming, sewing, felling, gathering, and trimming of underclothing. The fashion of ready-made linen not having yet vitiated the housewifely habits of Redcastle. The lower middle classes make their own garments laboriously, and are proud of their toil. The upper classes employ school children, reduced widows, or virtuous orphans for the labour, and contrive thereby to exercise a good deal of patronage at the very small expenditure. Sibyl revives considerably well this week of preparation. She manages to rest a good deal, other people taking the chief burden of getting her clothes made on their shoulders. She lies on the sofa in the shabby old parlour, staring idly at the white and yellow spring flowers that brighten the dull brown beds yonder in the family garden, the white pear blossoms tossing gaily in the light April wind, the jonquils peeping over the tall box border, the sword-shaped lily of the valley leaves cleaving the damp mould in the shadow of the bulging moss-grown wall, summer's harbinger in the shape of a butterfly skimming over the tender rose leaves. A dull old house verily, a limited prospect, this long strip of walled garden, yet sweet and soothing to one who has suffered. Sweet to lie at rest on the slumberous sofa, with no thought or care for the day, and with but the vaguest thought of the morrow. If Uncle Trenchard leaves me a fortune, life will be made so easy, Sybil muses, her arms folded above her head, her eyes fixed dreamily on the waving white pearl bloom. I shall have but to call Alex back to me, and we can be happy together again, and taste the sweets of life again, as we did in our brief bright honeymoon. Poverty and love cannot live long together, but love with plenty of money, that means paradise. The fortune dimly veiled though it is, seems very easy to her just now. She is elated by her uncle's evident admiration of her. She has made just the impression that she would have wished to make upon that fate-disposing relative. To follow up that impression will be simple enough. Has she not been told of her winning ways, of those small fascinations which make a woman powerful for good or evil? Has she not always been her Uncle Robert's favourite, everybody's favourite, without effort on her own part, while Marion, painfully anxious to please, has been looked on rather as a nuisance, a vivacious nonentity of whom one might easily have too much? Mr. Trenchard's carriage calls every afternoon, with its coachman and footman in respectable Puritan drab liveries, to take the two young ladies for an airing. Mr. Trenchard himself rarely making any use of the equipage, which he keeps rather as an appendage of his state than for pleasure or convenience. It is very agreeable to Sybil to drive up the long street with its ascending scale of social importance, from the shabby old houses at Uncle Robert's end of the town to the stately stone mansions above Bar. Very agreeable to pass the elite, whom Marion has just begun to know, and salutes with delighted becks and bows, but whom Sybil surveys with a stony stare, affecting to have not the slightest notion who they are. "That Faunthorpe girl is handsomer than ever," says Colonel Stormont to his wife, whom he is driving in a pony carriage a size or two larger than a washing basket. "She is pretty sure to come in for a tidy share of the old fellow's money, I should think. Not a bad match for Frederick." Frederick is the hope of the Stormonts, great at cricket, croquet and athletics, fire brigade and volunteer rifle corps, a youth with very thin legs and not much body, who wears a cutaway coat that just clears his hips, and has never been seen in an overcoat, or without a flower in his buttonhole. "No family," says Mrs. Stormont, pursing up her lips. "Family be bothered," remarks the Colonel. "Old Trenchard is rolling in money. What's the good of a family? It won't keep a roof over your head, or pay the tax-gatherer. Commerce is the thing nowadays. If Fred doesn't marry a rich woman pretty soon, he'll have to go into commerce. You ought to take notice of those Faunthorpe girls." "I'll call next week," replies Mrs. Stormont obediently. Sybil's beauty is the talk of the town. Redcastle is suddenly awakened to the consciousness of loveliness that scarcely moved it to admiration 2 years ago, although the girl's beauty had then the bloom and freshness of unchastened youth. Perhaps she is really lovelier now. Sorrow and passion have passed there, and left the exalted look of an awakened soul where there was before only girlish innocence, curious and wondering about a world of which it knew nothing. She has eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The mystery of life has been revealed to her. Be sure that Eve's beauty had a deeper meaning after she came out by the fatal gate where the angel with the flaming sword kept watch and ward. The carriage comes at the week's end to fetch Miss Faunthorpe and her belongings, to the tribulation of her young sister Jenny, who has had so much of Marion lately that she is deeply grieved to lose Sybil. "It will be ever so much worse for me when you're gone," she says. "You do stand up for a fellow sometimes. She'll be sending me upstairs for her handkerchief or her keys 3 times an hour, and making me crimp her hair till my fingers ache and unpick her old dresses. I wish Uncle Trenchard would let me go with you. I shouldn't cost much or be in the way. And now Uncle Robert says I'm not to go to school any more because it makes me vulgar. And Marion is to go on with my education. A nice education it will be. I don't believe she knows when William the Conqueror came over or who invented potatoes." Sybil tears herself from the lamenting damsel, kisses Uncle Robert with a plaintive little look, more expensive of gratitude than many a lengthy oration, and takes her place in the barouche, which becomes her as a frame does a picture, and seems as much her attribute as Juno's car to the goddess. "Goodbye, poverty," she says to herself as the chestnuts throw up their forelegs as if they were playing cup and ball and dash off towards the bar. "It shall go hard with me if my name is not written in Uncle Trenchard's will before long." End of chapter 10. Read by Adrian Stroet, Turks and Caicos Islands.
Chapter 11 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Kirchner. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 11. The new life at Lancaster Lodge suits Sybil as if she had been created for no other purpose than to sit at her uncle's table, pour out his coffee, air his newspapers, play or sing to him in the evenings, and take her own pleasure for the rest of the day. Housekeeping is an easy burden in so well-ordered an establishment. The trained servants perform their duties, light for the most part, with mechanical precision. The service is too good to be forfeited by scamped work or forgetfulness of the master's wishes. Stephen Trenchard has let his servants understand that he will have fullest value for his money, that there must be no talents stowed away in napkins in his household. He has contrived to inspire them with wholesome fear, and is served to the utmost of their power. Sybil is not afflicted with a genius for domestic matters. She remembers with a shudder those days in Dixon Street when she had to cater for a penniless husband and make 9 pence do the work of a shilling. She remembers this weary time and reposes in her low easy chair, novel in hand, the garden smiling at her through the open French window, horses and carriages at her disposal, luxury around her, all Redcastle, subjugated and more or less prostrated at her feet. She keenly remembers the past, and deems her present life worthy some sacrifice, more especially as the present is made still brighter by vague hopes of happiness, and a reconciliation of all life's perplexities in the future. She has her dark moments, naturally. What life is without shadow? There are moments when she thinks of one she has fondly loved still, perhaps, in some sealed chamber of her heart. There are hours in which she wonders with remorseful wonder how he fares whom she so ruthlessly abandoned. For his future advantage, she tells herself, as Mrs. Secretan, I should have forfeited my uncle's fortune. As Miss Faunthorpe, I may win it and share it with my husband. Established as Stephen Trenchard's favorite niece, Sybil finds herself an object of unbounded interest and admiration with the elite. Mrs. Stormont, although overflowing with kindness, at first shows some disposition to patronize. But finding this eldest Miss Faunthorpe a young woman not amenable to patronage, changes her note and accepts Mr. Trenchard's niece as one of ourselves, elected and chosen to sit in the high places of Redcastle. The girl has a wonderful air, argues Mrs. Stormont, when you consider that she is totally without family. Talking of family, muses the Colonel, I hope it's all right about old Trenchard's money, and that he hasn't left any niggers over in Calcutta to whom he may leave his fortune. "My dear Reginald, I'm surprised at you," exclaims the lady with a look of horror. "Mr. Trenchard goes to church every Sunday, and is altogether a most correct person." "We don't know what he may have been in India, though," says the colonel. "He may have been a devil worshipper, and danced an exaggerated Highland fling at devil dances, or a Mahometan, or a Brahmin, or a thug. He seems to have plenty of money, and that's about all we know of him." Notwithstanding which ignorance as to Stephen Trenchard's antecedents, the colonel and his wife continue to court and cherish him, arranging the nicest little dinners for him, with Mr. Groshen to sit opposite to him and discourse upon the money market, lavishing affection on Sibyl, inquiring kindly about the exiled Marian, as remote at the unvisited end of the town as if she had been removed to another hemisphere, and making themselves generally subservient and agreeable. Frederick Stormont, with his cutaway coat and legs like sticks of sealing wax, calls frequently at Lancaster Lodge, and is deeply interested in everything that interests Sibyl. The flower garden, the horses, he even volunteers to be interested in the poultry, but bottles his enthusiasm upon finding that Miss Faunthorpe has no taste for Dorkings, Spaniards, or Cochin Chinas. There is a billiard room at Lancaster Lodge, and Frederick is great at billiards. He drops in of an evening and plays with Mr. Trenchard. He teaches Sibyl how to handle her cue, and discourses wisely on the theory of angles. "Well, pretty one," says Mr. Trenchard one night, when Fred has taken his departure with obvious reluctance, and uncle and niece are loitering by the billiard table, Sibyl leaning over the green cloth to aim at the distant red, dressed in pale grey silk, with innumerable flounces, and knots of mauve ribbon dotted about among them, a masterpiece of Miss Eyelet's art. "Well, my pet, I think it's pretty clear what that young gentleman comes here for." "Billiards, I should think," replies Sibyl, pushing her cue gently backwards and forwards as she meditates her aim. "They have no table at the Stormonts, and it is cheaper for him to play here than at the Coach and Horses." "The billiard table is a very good excuse, my dear, but the gentleman comes to see you." "Poor threadpaper!" exclaims Sibyl with a contemptuous laugh. "For his own sake, if the thing can feel, I hope not." "Why, he'd be a very good match for you, wouldn't he?" asks her uncle, looking keenly at her from under his penthouse brows. "These Stormonts are great people, the leaders of Redcastle society. You could hardly do better than marry into their set." "If I were likely ever to marry, which I'm not," says Sibyl, pocketing her ball triumphantly off the red, "I'd marry a man." "Never likely to marry? What do you mean by that?" "Simply that I'm quite happy as I am, and that I mean to stop with you and take care of you, please, Uncle Stephen, until you get tired of me." She has been living with her rich uncle nearly 3 months, and there is no more talk of her being a visitor at Lancaster Lodge. It is her home. Marian may come and go, but Sibyl remains. Stephen Trenchard cannot do without her. "I shan't get tired of you in a hurry," answers Mr. Trenchard, "but I think for your own sake you ought to marry when you get a good opportunity. I was only joking about that whippersnapper who walks about the place as if the very paving stones were his property, and couldn't give you change for a 5-pound note if you asked him for it. He's not the man for you. But with your pretty face, you are sure to find the right kind of man before long, a man with brains and money, and when you do, I hope you'll be wise enough to marry him. It's all very well while I'm here to take care of you, but when I'm dead and gone—" "When you are dead and gone, I shall have your money, you dear old thing," thinks Sibyl, but says not a word. She only goes to her uncle's side, and lays her face upon his shoulder, and gives him one of those gentle little caresses which Marian would as soon have offered to the Zoological Gardens tiger as to her Anglo-Indian uncle. "Yes, pretty one, I should like to see you well married before my time comes," says Stephen Trenchard. "Now you know, uncle, that you are under a solemn agreement with me to live till you are 90, replies Sibyl, shaking her finger at him with playful menace. She has grown very intimate with her uncle in these 3 months. Her playing, her singing, her bright talk, Her sparkling, vivacious little ways have won the old man's confidence. Stern to all the rest of the world, implacable in all his dealing with men, suspicious alike of equals and inferiors, tyrannical to his servants, he is yet wondrously gentle to Sibyl. His inherent meanness, his mental incapacity to give, cannot be wholly subjugated even by her influence, but what money he bestows upon her he gives less grudgingly than to Marian. He feels the loss of so many pounds a shade less keenly when Sibyl's pleasure is in question, and though he grumbles sorely at the costliness of a woman's toilet, he is pleased to see his niece expensively dressed, and may in time come to regard her costume as one of the accessories of his own grandeur, like his stables or hothouses. Rarely, despite the confidence that is established between them, has Mr. Trenchard talked to Sibyl of his past life. Of his youth, never. He tells her his prosy old stories of Calcutta society, of men with whom he has had commercial dealings, of clever frauds and chicaneries, which he chuckles over as the coup d'etat of the trading world, but of himself he speaks very little. Never, above all, has the fatal name of Secretan crossed his lips, and Sibyl is longing to find out the state of his feelings now, after this lapse of time, in relation to that name. If he had learned in the lapse of years to forgive the man he injured and overreached, if he had grown to feel some touch of remorseful pity for the supplanted son, what a happiness it would be to fall on her knees at his feet and confess the secret of her life, to be pardoned for her duplicity, set free from the toil and trouble of falsehood, able to call her proud young husband back to her side, and to begin life again, honest in the sight of man and at peace with God. She is continually musing upon this question, and would give much for an opportunity of sounding her uncle's feelings. It comes one day unawares, and she has no longer need to speculate or wonder about Stephen Trenchard's sentiments upon the subject of an old enemy. It is a drowsy July afternoon. The summer is at its hottest, and Mr. Trenchard and his niece are sitting on the lawn after that elaborate meal, half breakfast, half luncheon, which the Anglo-Indian calls tiffin. The lawn behind Lancaster Lodge is a delightful place on a warm summer day. 3 or 4 old elms, a spreading cedar, a Spanish chestnut, and a couple of noble plane trees afford abundant shade. The grass is smooth as velvet. Garden chairs, low and luxurious, are dotted about under the trees. Newspapers and Sibyl's work-basket bestrew the light iron table. Changing lights and shadows flit and flicker among the leaves, and Stephen Trenchard's lean figure, stretched to its full length, reposes at ease on a bamboo reclining chair, a glass of potash water on one side of him, a cigar case on the other. Sibyl is reading to him out of yesterday's Times, when he interrupts her with a sudden sigh which is almost a groan. "What is the matter, Uncle Stephen?" "You had better leave off. Even your soft voice irritates me." "Your nervous headache not gone yet, Uncle Stephen?" "Gone? It's worse than ever. This English summer is more oppressive than Indian heat, or it seems so to me at any rate." Sibyl searches in the little work-basket lined with blue satin, fishes out a silver stoppered scent bottle, and is on her knees by her uncle's side in a moment, dabbing his yellow forehead with her handkerchief steeped in eau de cologne. "Thank you, my dear, that will do. I don't care about it." He gives her an impatient little push, as disapproving so much fuss, but not before she has disarranged one of those terrier ear wisps of iron gray hair, and has been startled by a scar which disfigures the forehead beneath it, a long narrow seam which crosses the temple diagonally, just below the roots of the hair. "Uncle Stephen, were you ever in battle?" "Battle, child? What nonsense! Of course not." "Or in a mutiny, or anything? How did you get this dreadful scar?" From the foul blow of a scoundrel, answered Stephen Trenchard, deadly pale, from the man who lamed me for life. Did you never hear your mother speak of Philip Secretan? Yes, Uncle Stephen, I have heard her say that he treated you very badly. Oh, she owned as much, did she? The world in general would have it that I used him badly, that I had no right to the money his father left me, a paltry 30,000, that I ought to have stood on one side and said, no, blood is thicker than water. You've been an idler and a profligate, a bad son. The business would have gone to wreck and ruin if it had been left to you to save it. I've toiled, I've slaved, I've planned and plotted, I've borne the heat and burden of the day. But still, you are the son, and you've a right to come in at the 11th hour and rob me of my just reward simply because you are the son. That's what the world would have had me do, in the high and mighty justice it is, so good at dealing out for other people, and so bad at yielding on its own account. Some went so far as to say that the will was forged, and I was the forger. Luckily for me, old Mr. Secretan had published his intention of disinheriting his son and making me his heir the year of the great Manchester failures, when his house tottered, and I had the luck to save it by a desperate stroke of business. He was very fond of you, I suppose, this old Mr. Secretan? Asked Sybil breathlessly. Fond of me? Yes, perhaps as much as it was in his nature to be fond of anything except money. He hated his son, knowing that he was a spendthrift, and would squander every shilling the old man had toiled for. He trusted me. He looked up to me. If you were my son, he used to say, I shouldn't be tortured by the thought that this business would go to ruin when I'm in my grave. The day he said that, for the first time I made up my mind that I was to be his heir. Philip's follies and vices helped me, but my own patience and industry were the chief agents. And there was a quarrel between you and Philip Secretan? Asked Sybil, seated on the grass and plucking up little tufts of it nervously, as she watches her uncle's vindictive face with eager eyes, reading doom there. Yes, when the will had been read, and he knew the worst, he ought to have expected it if he had a grain of sense. Philip Secretan followed me out into the grounds. His father's house was a few miles outside Manchester, a fine old place enough, but neglected. The old man was too fond of money to spend much on house or gardens. Philip followed me to the back of the grounds, where there was a wild bit of shrubbery and a hollow that had once been a stone quarry, and which had been left either because people didn't care about the expense of filling it or because they fancied it was picturesque. In any case, it was dangerous and an abomination that ought to have been done away with. Well, I was close to the edge of this hollow, there being a short cut to the Manchester road just beyond it, when Philip overtook me. He didn't spare me, I can tell you, for apart from the money question, there was an old sore between us. The girl he wanted to marry had done me the honor to prefer his father's confidential clerk. She was a sensible girl, and saw the point to which our lives were drifting. When he had called me reptile and a few other equally agreeable names, finding that he couldn't sting me into retaliation by abuse of that kind, he came close up to me and struck me across the face with his open hand. "There, cur," he cried, "and let's see if that will warm your fish's blood into manly feeling." I had been in a burning rage all the time at his insolence, but had held myself in check, in pity for his disappointment, which was hard to bear, no doubt, richly as he had deserved it. I was a man, and the shame of a blow was too much even for my sluggish temper, trained to patience by long servitude. I closed with him, and we wrestled together on that path by the quarry. Now mark the cowardice of this fine gentleman who boasted of his honor and called me a sneak and reptile. He was twice my match in weight and size, 3 times my match in training. A practiced athlete, a skilled boxer, every muscle developed by exercise. To use his force against mine was simply murder. I was the shuttlecock and he the battledore. I had a confused sense of blows raining on my head as from a Nasmyth's hammer, colored sparks dancing before my eyes, fire shooting out of my brain, and then I was hurled bodily into the air and fell crashing through the brushwood into the quarry. It seemed like falling from the highest cliff that breasts the Atlantic. "How dreadful!" says Sybil, with a gasp. It was deep in the night when I awoke, and the stars were shining. I wondered where I was and how I came to see the pole star looking straight down at me. Pain came before memory, acute, agonizing pain, and then I knew that my leg had been shattered somehow. I lay in the quarry till past 8 o'clock next morning, suffering indescribable torture. At last, however, some laborers heard my faint cries for help, found me, and carried me to the nearest roadside inn, whence I was conveyed to the Manchester infirmary. Here I lay for 5 months, the most miserable months of my life, while the fractured bones united. It was a compound fracture, and for some time I was threatened with amputation. When I rose from the hospital bed, I was lame for life. The broken leg had contracted in the process of healing. Surgery had done its best for me and had saved my leg, but surgery left me a cripple, for which lifelong injury I had to thank Philip Secretan. I had to thank him for something else, too, for the girl who had pretended to love me chose this time for throwing me over and making a better match. And in those weary months lying on your bed of pain, you learned to forgive your enemy, suggests Sybil very gently. Learn to forgive him? Yes, if forgiveness means undying hatred, if forgiveness means the rankling memory of an unatonable wrong, if forgiveness means to remember him and curse him every time a change of wind brings back the old grinding pain in this crippled limb, if that means forgiveness, Philip Secretan and his race are forgiven. His race? Falters Sybil. You could feel no rancor against his children. I could, I do, answers the old man vindictively. Let no viper of that blood cross my path. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. There's scripture for you. I believe in that good old heathen creed one reads of in Greek legends, of an accursed race. Of Philip Secretan's after career I know little or nothing. He had the devil's luck as well as his own, and married a woman with money, soon after his father's death, but I never heard what became of him. He may be living or dead. If he lives, let him keep out of my way. If he has left children, my dearest hope is that they are penniless, homeless, street Arabs, whose playground is the gutter, whose ultimate destiny is the gallows. Uncle, for mercy's sake. My curse light on him and his seed to the 3rd generation. There, child, don't cry. You should have known better than to tempt me to talk of Philip Secretan. End of chapter 11.